One of the things that we're always hearing is how the Israelis are winning and the resistance is losing. And I think we all know that Iran has been losing for what, 50, almost 50 years now? We're always
Since the
imploding,
revolution.
falling
Yeah.
apart. Yeah, we're always falling apart. At least the Western narrative is consistent. We're always losing. It's always a defeat for us. But if Iran is losing, then why didn't the Israeli regime continue the war? Why didn't the Americans continue the war? I mean, if I was winning a war and I consider this enemy to be existential, then I just finish the job. It's obvious. But they didn't because they couldn't, because they lost. And Steve Bannon, I think at least on two occasions, on two that I've seen, he put, he's very well informed. He said that Trump saved Netanyahu. He saved the Israeli regime because the Israeli regime was being hammered. And during the final days, the Iranians didn't need to fire so many missiles because almost all of them were getting through.
That moment right there pulls the curtain back. If Israel or the US had true dominance in this war, they would have pushed forward. That's what superpowers do when they see an opening. But the fact that they didn't, that they paused, tells us everything. It wasn't strategic mercy, it was exhaustion, limits, and fear of escalation. And Bannon's comment about Trump stepping in to save Netanyahu, well, that confirms that this wasn't a calculated win, it was a scramble for survival. In geopolitics, silence after a barrage often signals loss, not victory.
Remember, 20 years ago, 23 years ago, when Bush gave his State of the Nation speech to Congress, and he first used the axis of evil term for basically it was for Iran. It was Iraq under Saddam Hussein, their own agent. They gave him chemical weapons to wage war against Iran. Then they turned against him. I don't want to go into that, but your younger viewers should just remember that they gave him chemical weapons. They gave him chemical weapons to use against Iranians and then Iraq and the Iraqis. And then later they invaded the country in the name and destroyed the country in the name of chemical weapons, which they no longer had. But so it was Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, right? So Iran really was the focus of Western animosity because of Palestine, because Iran was independent.
That independence is exactly what made Iran such a threat in the eyes of Washington. Back then, America could afford to isolate adversaries like Iran. But today, their energy is split across multiple fronts. The unipolar moment is over. That shift from dominance to distraction is what's reshaping the world order right now.
The only real independent country in the region, and probably in some ways the most independent country in the world, but also because of Iran's stance on Palestine. Well, today, the United States can no longer focus on Iran like it did back then, because that was the unipolar moment. That was the height of US power, and Iran was isolated. Now the United States and the West, their energy is focused on Russia. It's focused on China. It's focused even now on India and Brazil and elsewhere. They don't have the power that they had 22, 23 years ago. So they can say that Iran is falling apart all they like. They are in trouble, and the resistance is not going away. These think tankers in the United States, I heard this Sajjadpur person, who talks nonsense a lot, and others, I don't know what he said because I don't follow these people, but they've been talking about how Iran is weak. Well, we've been hearing that for many years. But what I'm seeing is a United States that's deeply divided. What I'm seeing is a United States where the middle class has collapsed. What I'm seeing is a United States where Charlie Kirk, when he's murdered, the narrative.
It's all in Israel.
It's telling how quickly trust erodes. Whether people agree or not, the fact that so many instinctively question the official version, that's a measure of how deep the credibility crisis runs. Washington and Tel Aviv aren't just losing geopolitical ground, they're losing faith among their own people.
The FBI narrative is all fake.
Right.
And regardless of who carried out the murder, it's definitely not what they say it is. And the fact that people immediately point fingers at the Israeli regime shows how discredited the political regime in Washington and the Israeli regime are, regardless of who did it. regardless if you listen to Candace Owens and you're completely convinced or not, that's another issue altogether. You have a country deeply divided, where the armed forces are going into cities, where every time Trump opens his mouth against China, the stock market falls. This is not the United States that was what one Frenchman called at some point the hyperpower. We're not living in that world anymore. So I don't, regardless of what they say in these Western think tanks, they're not winning. They're losing, and they've lost the hearts and minds of the world. Their economies are floundering, especially the Europeans, and they're losing militarily. They're becoming increasingly desperate. This talk of tomahawks and all that, the stupidity of Western regimes and the escalation that they're carrying up, but they're losing. That's the point that I'm trying to make. They are not this empire, this empire that lasted for hundreds of years, which has been targeting the global majority, but also which targets their own people.
Empires don't just collapse because they're challenged abroad. They implode when they turn on their own. The economic decay, the political fractures, the growing desperation in Western propaganda, these are symptoms of something deeper. History shows us that when legitimacy fades, so does power.
People in the West are waking up to this. People across the world are waking up to this, and they do not have the power that they had before. So they can say what they want about Iran, the axis of resistance. We're always losing and being defeated. Fine, they can keep saying that. But at the end of the day, if the Israeli regime strikes Iran, they can kill many of us. They can silence many of us. But they're going to lose the war, and they're going to be people better than the likes of myself who will come out and raise their voices and continue the struggle against the apartheid regime, and this regime will ultimately collapse.
This is the long arc of resistance he's speaking to. You don't need to agree with every tactic or narrative, but across history, from Algeria to Vietnam to South Africa, when enough people are willing to speak out and stand up, even powerful regimes eventually fold under pressure.
The two-state solution was fake from day one. All of these Western regimes knew that there was never any plan for a real two-state solution. They were buying time for the regime. And the regime was planting these colonizers, these fanatics, these crazy people, so that no one could remove them. Even the Israeli regime, if it wanted to, they could not remove them. So what were the Palestinians supposed to do? Sit back and wait for them to continue mowing the lawn? Ultimately, what happened in Gaza would have happened. And they will continue this genocide. But the important thing is that the world has woken up. And the axis of resistance and the broader resistance, they're not going to go away. So the Israeli regime is no longer able to rule supreme militarily or in the propaganda war. In fact, I think they have become utterly foolish and stupid in their propaganda.
Propaganda loses its grip when it loses coherence. The shift from persuasive messaging to outright absurdity is a classic sign of desperation, and people, especially younger generations, can smell it. Once trust is broken, even slick messaging can't patch it up.
When I was young, they were pretty good. Their Haspara and their propaganda was pretty effective. They were lying, but now it's like they're behaving like desperate people. How when someone is desperate, their decisions and their actions are not reasonable and logic. Even within their sinister worldview, there's a certain logic. But now it's as if they, in their, within that sinister space of theirs, they have no reason and logic. Even the propaganda that they produce, it's like if it was an anti-Zionist, it's as if an anti-Zionist organization was producing this material. Again, as I said earlier, it's all downhill for the regime. We're going to have dark days ahead. We're going to have dark months ahead. There are going to be perhaps dark years ahead. Resistance movements and liberation movements, they don't achieve victory overnight. That's not what happened across Africa. That's not what happened in Latin America. That's not what happened across Asia. They didn't get their liberation through, like, I don't know, it wasn't as if Nelson Mandela, he came out and suddenly they were enlightened. The regime in South Africa was collapsing. And by the way, Desmond Tutu, Archbishop, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, when he traveled to Palestine, and this is way before this Holocaust, he said that the situation in Palestine is far worse than anything he had ever seen in apartheid South Africa. But in any case, back then in South Africa, it wasn't as if suddenly the government decided that enough was enough and we should give these people freedom. No, it was because the regime could not continue, because the regime was falling apart, because the world had turned against it. And the same thing is happening in Palestine. The only difference is that Zionism has powerful roots across the Western political establishment. But the West itself is falling apart. They no longer have that hegemony that they had over the world.
That's not just analysis, it's observation. The U.S. can no longer dictate outcomes unilaterally. Every front it opens, from Russia to China to Iran, it finds resistance. And that resistance is increasingly coordinated, patient, and informed. The old rules no longer apply.
This is not the 1990s. This is not even 2020. They wage economic war on China, they have to back down. They wage a military war against Russia, they have to back down. They wage a war against Iran, they have to back down. The world is changing and it will continue to change because the West in its arrogance is picking a fight against everyone. And when you fight everyone, you lose against everyone. And the weaker the West becomes, the weaker the Israeli regime becomes, because the Israeli regime is a puny, weak, and utterly dependent regime. Who does it depend on? It depends on the United States and Western regimes. Europe is declining. The United States is declining. People inside the United States and Europe are waking up. This is all bad news for the regime.
It's a paradox. The more the West weakens, the more the Israeli regime loses its safety net. It's a geopolitical dependency that's becoming unsustainable. And as public awareness grows, both in the West and globally, that dependency becomes harder to defend.
So the resistance against the Israeli regime is global. The future is not good, but it's going to be painful days ahead. But those who try to blame the victim, they are shameless, and people shouldn't be fooled by that narrative. That narrative is coming from these Western centers of power. They're lying, but they're trying to eat away at this coalition. They're trying to raise questions among those who are supporting Palestinian children. The resistance has every right to resist. And if it did not happen on October the 7th, whenever they wanted to do it, the same results they would have seen the same result.
That's the sobering reality. This isn't about one flashpoint or one date. It's about a tide of resistance that's building despite all odds. And while we may disagree on policies or strategies, one thing is clear: the old narratives are crumbling, and power, real power, is shifting. We're not just watching a conflict play out, we're watching the end of an era and the messy, painful birth of whatever comes next.